All right, welcome everybody to the first installment of our webinar series on as continuing education modules for educators here in the state of Louisiana. My name is John DePriest. I work in English for academic purposes in the Center for Global Education at Tulane University. And I was formerly the president of Louisiana LaTESOL, the Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages. And I'm excited to welcome two other members of our organization here today, Carolyn Jones and Diane Pellegrin, who will be asking questions and helping to host our first guest speaker of this series, Ms. Kathleen Gasparian. Kathleen Gasparian, as you can see, is an immigration attorney with Gasparian Spivey Immigration. And she'll be touching on current trends in enforcement and immigration benefits to focus on children. And so she has a link to her website here for her law firm, and we'll be posting these slides on the Louisiana LaTESOL website following the webinar. And that is latesol.wildapricot.org. So we'll also be posting a recording of this webinar on our website. So for anyone who's tuning in, you can see that later. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Ms. Kathleen Gasparian to present her information for today.
Great. John, thank you so much. Thank you, Louisiana LaTESOL, for having me come and do this module. So this is module 1, right? This is our building blocks. This is the very beginning. This is basic concepts that hopefully as we go through different modules and as this project grows is going to form a really good foundation for giving you information about issues that you run across on a regular basis. So I do want to say, if any of you have had anything to do with immigration ever, you know that immigration is a very political animal and that immigration situations and law change all the time. We are recording this in May of 2023. And so what we're talking about today may not all be the same in a couple of months. So be thoughtful about when you're listening to this, who knows what changes might have happened. Also, while we're talking about legal issues, this whole webinar is not meant to be legal advice, right? Every good lawyer is only as good as their disclaimer, right? So please don't think that this is meant to be solving legal problems or legal issues. We would always encourage people to get to a good lawyer, a good immigration lawyer, or good community resources in your state. But this is just really meant to be basic information about how the process works so that as these issues come up in your work and in your daily lives, that you don't feel so lost at sea, right? This is just meant to be a good little skeleton foundation to build on. So in oversimplifying immigration law, right? So keep in mind, this is also basic building blocks, very easy simplifications that as we go through, we will start getting into some of the nuances, but today we're starting with the basics. So I always say immigration law divides people up into 5 basic categories, okay? The first is US citizens. And if you think about it as like a mountain or preferences, citizens are running around the top. They're fully admitted to our political and economic country, right? You can run for office, you can be on a jury, you can vote, you can do all of the things. And you can also be really bad and not get kicked out. That's the great thing about being a citizen. There are different ways you become a citizen. That's by being born inside the geography of the United States or born outside of the US to US citizen parents. You might acquire your citizenship at birth. You might not start off as a citizen, but become one through acts of your parent. Or you may work your way up the mountain and become a citizen through application. So citizenship is, what the first category that we look at. The second category is what we call an immigrant. And in the vernacular, this is the green card or permanent residence. That means an individual who's come to the United States, has permission to live and work wherever they want. They're in a lawful status. It's a misnomer, right? It's not really permanent. You can lose it if you do certain things or if you stay out of the US too long. But it's sort of like, it's immigrant meaning the ability to stay and work sort of indefinitely, right? Permanently, without being tied to a specific employer or things like that. Then we have non-immigrants. So those are people who have come to the US for a specific purpose for a limited time. And we think of this in a lawful status. And so there's a whole alphabet soup of non-immigrants. Those are common ones are tourist or H-1B, that's for certain types of work, or H-2A, which is agricultural workers. There's also athletes and religious and all sorts of, like I said, alphabet soup, but that's non-immigrant. And it implies that there's been this formality of process, okay? Then we have people who are in the United States who are in a period of permission. They have some sort of authorization from the US government to be present here, but they're not yet a permanent resident and they're not a non-immigrant. And this could be all sorts of different things. And it's sort of a nice catch-all phrase, but we would include this in this: people who have refugee status, people who are applying for asylum or have asylum, people who have DACA. So it's an authorization that doesn't fit into those other kinds of categories. And while immigrant and non-immigrant have an implication of like paperwork, right, a formality of process, not everybody who fits into the other category has come in with permission, right? So it can be a distinction. And then we have the final category, which is the undocumented. And the undocumented in this conversation means an individual who isn't any of those other things, right? Who does not have authorization to be in the United States. And that could be somebody who came in with permission and overstayed, or it could be somebody who came in without permission, so completely undocumented. So all of those distinctions matter because it determines what pathways a person might have to moving up the mountain or changing their status or having authorization to be here. So again, to completely oversimplify immigration and the complexities of immigration, I always say there's so you have your 5 types of people. You also have your 5 basic paths of getting lawful status or permission to be in the United States, right? So the first pathway is family. Family migration makes up like 60%. It's more than a majority of the way that of permanent residents and people lawfully migrating to the US. So family means really close family. If I'm a US citizen, I can ask for my spouse, I can ask for my children. Permanent residents can ask for spouse and children as well. Citizens can also ask for their parents and their brothers and sisters. But immigration law divides those family relationships up to what's called preferences. And so things like spouse of a US citizen is very high up in preference, no waiting lines, whereas brother and sister is lower in preference and may have waiting lines of decades, 20, 30 years or more. So, but family can be a pathway to coming to the United States or to changing your category to a different category. Employment is the second biggest category of people who are coming to the United States. That is usually requires an employer to sponsor, both for a temporary visa, non-immigrant, or for permanent residence. And that process can take years and years and years. Sometimes it's quick. The more we want you, oftentimes the shorter the process. Then we have a category of asylum, refugee, humanitarian programs, special programs, sometimes certain things a person can apply for in front of an immigration judge. So basically like humanitarian needs and processes. That's a pathway of coming. We do have a visa lottery. It's called the diversity lottery that can lead to permanent residence. It's a very, very, very small percentage of US immigration, but it's out there for individuals who are coming from countries with low levels of migration, and it leads to permanent residence. And then we have money, right? Investment gets you a pathway to, there may be a way to a temporary status, but there may also be a way to permanent residence. At the current time, the investment is 1.8 million plus creating jobs. Sometimes it can be 900,000, but it's out there. It's rare, but it's out there. So you have those 5 kind of big pathways that everybody's following to come to the US. So when I talk about immigration law, when I talk about what an immigration lawyer does, or I talk about somebody's immigrating, what am I meaning? I'm talking about who can come to the US, right? So immigration law sets the rules for who's allowed to come to the United States, how they get to the United States, right? Or how people get to the United States is something that immigration law is very concerned about. And that's not just like what mode of transportation did they take, bus, bicycle, airplane, but it's also about what kind of documents they use or statuses they have to enter the US. Immigration law is about who can stay in the US, right? Just because you get here doesn't mean you get to hang out forever. Your status may run out, or you do something that gets you kicked out, right? There's a set of rules that's about who can enter, and there's a different rule about once you're here, who's allowed to stay and what that looks like. Immigration law is also about enforcing laws about employment and about employing individuals with authorization and enforcing that against employers. If you've ever filled out an I-9, you have run into the most ubiquitous immigration form that's out there, right? And it's also, immigration law is also about how do foreign nationals move from one category to the other? How do I move from non-immigrant to immigrant? Or how do I move from immigrant to citizen? Or how do I move from no status of undocumented to anything else? So that's always what we're looking at. Immigration law, very complex, also because there's so many different branches of the government that are involved with immigration law, right? You have the Department of State at the US embassies. You have the Immigration Court, which is the Executive Office for Immigration Review within the Department of Justice. Sometimes there's the Department of Labor is involved in employment-based processes or in certain employment-based non-immigrant visas. So all of those agencies, plus on top of that, of course, the biggest agency of them all, the Department of Homeland Security. And within the Department of Homeland Security, then you have sub-agencies. You have Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. That's the agency that gives benefits, right? That's the agency that is making most of the time decisions about who gets asylum and who gets an H-1B visa and, you know, the different petitions in the process. You have Customs and Border Protection. Those are the officers at the southern and northern border, right? Those are also the officers in the airports and at ports, right? They're doing customs. Nobody talks about customs anymore, right? They're doing the customs, right? Do you have seeds? Did you bring in something you weren't supposed to? But they are also the ones that are inspecting individuals who are coming to the United States, right? And then you have ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So think of this as the prosecutors in deportation proceedings, but they're also the cops, right? They're the cops and the prosecutors. They're doing the investigations of employers, but they're also investigating trafficking and people who are here without authorization and everything else. So it's big, big, broad swaths that they're doing. Other agencies also come in, like the FBI sometimes, There's all these tangents that come in. You'll notice that all of those agencies are under the executive branch, right? Which is when we talk about immigration shifts with politics, that's part of the reason why. They're all run by the executive branch and has a, you know, yes, there's an underlying statute, but there's also a lot that happens with whoever's in charge, right? And their priorities. So how are people actually getting to the United States? Well, if they're coming as a non-immigrant, a lot of the times there's something that gets filed here with USCIS. Not always, right? If I'm a tourist, I'm just going straight to the embassy. But a lot of times there may be something that comes first within the US. So some sort of process here, then the foreign national goes to a US embassy, gets a sticker in their passport that basically says, the US embassy says all the paperwork's in order. And then the person enters the US and has an interaction with Customs and Border Protection, right? Customs and Border Protection doesn't have to follow the visa sticker, right? It's not automatic, it's a separate inspection. So, you know, that's right there. That's 3 different places where things are getting looked at and can be approved and denied. And then once in the US, there's probably ongoing applications or paperwork once within the US. There's some exceptions, right? Like Canadians don't need visas to come into the US. You know, if you're coming from Europe just as a tourist, you can come in on ESTA. But in general, when you're doing something like work, you're going to have to go through this kind of sort of robust process to come to the US. If you're coming as a permanent resident, as an immigrant, right? If it's through employment, first we might have to deal with the Department of Labor, family, employment, investment. Then there's a petition with immigration. And then the foreign national is making an application at a US embassy, or if they fit the rules, there's an application that's here in the US, right? Not all the steps apply in all cases, but the general thing to walk away with is it takes a long time sometimes to do these processes. And it's not just for brothers and sisters a long time, right? Like it can even be a year or 2 for a spouse of a US citizen to work their way through the whole process. Sometimes through work, it can take, you know, years as well. So it's not really, nothing is ever instantaneous in immigration or consistent, right? Now, another way that people are getting to the US is called parole. This is something that for a long time we saw, you know, pretty rarely, but has really been used a lot lately in the last 2 years, last couple of years. It's really gained a lot of usage. It's something that's always existed in the law. It's not new. It's been around for a long time, but it's been used lately in a way that it hasn't been used before. What am I talking about? So if I come to the United States with a sticker in my passport, I get admitted at the border, right? I'm a non-immigrant, I'm an immigrant. But if I come to the US and I'm in like the airport or I'm at the border, the officer can give me permission to physically enter the US, but it's like I have a little invisible legal bubble around me, right? I haven't been admitted under the law. I'm physically able to walk around, but I'm still considered legally to be outside the US knocking to come in. So it means I'm arriving. It's called a parole. And there's different kinds of parole, some based on discretion, some based on humanitarian issues. But the way we have been seeing it a lot lately is parole for individuals from places that are going through great upheaval, Venezuela, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Central America. And it gives people a way to get here and be in other, remember we talked about those categories, be in sort of a permission to be here, maybe get permission to work, and have a time in the US in order to figure out what comes next. And so it's really been used really robustly. So that's a great thing. We're also seeing it for certain Central American children. And in lots of cases, this again requires an application or a petition with immigration or some sort of application before. You can't just, it's usually some sort of process in advance before being given parole and allowed to physically enter the US. So how are people coming into the US, right? So we talked about with visas, with permission through that inspection process, but also people are coming in without authorization, right? And what that looks like makes a big difference in what they're able to do in the US and what potentials there are for getting a better status than what they have. So coming in between, walking across or swimming across without any interaction with the Department of Homeland Security, we call that entry without inspection. That could also be maybe, being stowing away in a cargo container or a truck or something like that. Sometimes though, lately, obviously, if you've been watching the news, right, we know that there are a lot of people who are coming to the southern border, having an interaction with the Department of Homeland Security, and then entering the United States physically. Those interactions, sometimes the people are coming into the United States physically and being detained and being also placed into deportation, removal proceedings. Sometimes people are coming in under what's called an order of supervision. They have to report to ICE, and that it's not, they may or may not, depending on the circumstances, they probably don't get work authorization. Maybe they do. Maybe they're into removal proceedings. Maybe they're not, right? Sometimes there's no supervision order. They're just in removal proceedings. And sometimes they're given parole at the border with the idea that they are then going to go, and they may be put into removal proceedings and they may not, right? So there's all this sort of different things that can happen. Every single thing makes a big difference as to what a person's allowed to do and how they can move through. And of course, we always talk about sometimes people come through a checkpoint, but they don't really have a passport, or they come through with somebody else's documents, right? Or they come through and it wasn't something they wanted to do, right? Those are forced migrations. All of those are gray areas that can really make a difference and way more complicated than Module 1. So sort of the truth about immigration, can be, if you fall into undocumented, it can be very difficult to get out of undocumented and into something else, right? It can be very difficult to move up the mountain, right? The more regulated your entry was, right? Visa, embassy, CBP, usually that means you have more options, but not always. There are very, very few ways for individuals to self-sponsor to come to the United States in temporary ways or in permanent residence. I would say, think of it like, the best and the brightest usually have a way, or the wealthiest usually have a way. Everybody else needs a sponsor of some kind, an employer or an anchor. There are very few automatic paths. In other words, just because I came on a work visa doesn't mean I'm automatically going to become a permanent resident, right? There's going to have to be new filings and interventions at every level. It's lengthy, it's difficult, it's expensive. That's not even with a lawyer, right? That's just like the filing fees to immigration. Making immigration mistakes have really big consequences. So for example, if I come in without permission and I stay here for a year and then I want to get lawful, well, the only way I might be able to do that is to leave and come back in with permission. But I've been here, I've already messed up. And so now my consequence is to sit out for 10 years. And I may not be able to get rid of that consequence. So it can be really impossible sometimes for people to move up the mountain, so to speak. Don't think of the law as fair or just, right? I will say that there's not a lot of fairness or justness in immigration law. So what are some of the big things we're seeing in our communities right now that really impact the people that you're having contact with? So the first thing is immigration courts, right? So immigration courts are the judges who are deciding whether or not a person has authorization to stay in the US, granting asylum, granting ways to stay here, issuing orders of removal, which is deportation. Currently, the conservative estimates are that the backlog is over 1.6 million, which, what does that mean? It means people can be in removal proceedings for years, 5 years, 8, I mean, like easily years and years and years. And throughout that whole process, maybe they don't have permission to work, or they don't, you know, it can be these really lengthy, emotionally draining processes. It's currently under the Department of Justice. There's been a big push to move immigration courts into the judiciary, what's called an Article 1 court. It's always something for you activists out there that you can try and agitate for. We'll see, right? Congress would have to make the law. Very relevant, I think, for those of you working with kids and in Louisiana, of course, is what's called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Remember my 5 kinds, right? So DACA falls into that other, right? It's not a visa, it's not permanent residence. Basically, we call it in my office, very low hanging fruit, right? The idea is it's for kids who were brought to the U.S., kids who came to the U.S. or were brought to the U.S. young, have been here and have either gone to school or served in the military. It gives them a way to get work authorization and hopefully a way to find a way up the mountain. It's gone through a lot of litigation. It was created in 2012 under Obama. There was litigation. Trump ended it. Biden brought it back. We think it's in a quagmire. So basically where it is right now, which is if somebody applied for DACA back under Obama and they got DACA, they can keep renewing their work card and they can get permission to travel and things like that. But anybody else, they can apply, but nobody's making decisions on it. We don't yet have new DACA, and the proposals that Biden put out keep the dates of DACA way back when, which means entered before like 2006. I mean, it's a really long time ago. So it's not going to do anything to help anybody who's arrived recently or any, you know, new kids, but it's something that would help people who've been here for a long time. So TPS is also very big in our community. Louisiana hosts a large population of Hondurans, and this is something that was granted for Honduras and Central America back in the late 90s. So TPS means temporary protected status. And again, this is in that other category. What it is it means the government will give out work authorization and will not try to deport. It doesn't by itself lead to permanent residence. It doesn't lead to anything better than that. And you have to take steps to do it. Basically, immigration is saying the situation in your country is bad. We're not going to send you back to it. You have to, the foreign national has to meet certain presence requirements and things like that. It was granted for Honduras and Central America back in the 90s. And so it's only for people who were here back then for those countries. We have new designations of TPS all the time. We've had recent designations for Ukraine, Afghanistan, Haiti, and so when things are bad in a country, it is a safety net for people who are here. Our concern, right, is that there has been a big movement to end these long-held TPSs, temporary protected status. It's not really temporary if it's been around for 20 years, I guess, trying to end those statuses, which will have a big impact on our community. You know, there's still probably a couple thousand people in those TPSs, and that could have a great impact on families and kids. And so that's something we really care about. Again, it's not going to help your recent arrivals, but it may be something that somebody in their family has. Okay. Refugee and asylum. This is something everybody always wants to talk about. So both of these are words that often get mixed up, okay? But because they're really closely related. They are both about our country giving protection to people who are going to be harmed because of their race, religion, national origin, social group, political opinion. That might mean being indigenous, that might mean being LGBTQ, that might mean being all sorts of different, your politics. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. There's lots of them out there. A asylee, asylum is given to a person who is present in the US and makes an application for protection. Refugee is a person who is outside of the US and makes an application for protection. Okay, so if I'm in the US and I've been, I'm here, I can't be a refugee, and if I'm outside the US, I can't be an asylee, right? That's the distinction. The way it works for refugees, right? They have to be outside of the US. There has to be a humanitarian concern to the US, right? They have to be a humanitarian concern of us, meet the definition of refugee, right? Can't go home, going to be harmed. They have to be admissible, meaning they have to meet our laws for security and health and things like that. And they can't already have a safe place to go. In other words, if like Sweden gave them asylum, or Sweden is letting them resettle there as a refugee, they're not going to be able to also be a US refugee. And so the process is basically they have to get designated abroad as a refugee. And it's US RAP is the agency that does it. There has to be a designation abroad, and it's all done abroad. It's not done here. It's all done with the agencies abroad. Usually no US attorneys are involved. It's just done abroad. And then the person gets to enter the US, and after a period of time is allowed to apply for permanent residence. Refugee status is great. It gives lots of benefits, lots of access to different kinds of benefits in the US, but very difficult and lengthy to obtain. Asylum seekers are people who are here in the US, and who are afraid to return home for one of those reasons, right? And it doesn't matter what kind of status you have, documented, undocumented, non-immigrant, that person can apply for asylum. You have the keys for asylum are showing there's a potential of harm. There's also time bars, right? If you've been in the United States for a long time, you may not fit within the rules for asylum. It talks about applying within 1 year of entry. But so the problem with asylum, right, is it's a really lengthy process because the number of people applying far exceed the resources allocated to asylum adjudications. So it is very normal for people to be waiting years, 3, 4, 5 years to have a decision made on their asylum application. As you can imagine, that can mean the country conditions change and all things like that, or the law changes, the political powers change, and so it can be really shifting grounds for asylum. So it's the good thing is there's a possibility in there for work authorization. It does lead to protection in the US. If your asylum claims wins, then you can become a permanent resident after 1 year of having asylum status. Also, having asylum status makes it possible to access many different kinds of public benefits in the US, so it can be a really meaningful solution for a lot of people, as well as, of course, keeping people safe, which is the most important thing. For children, one of the pathways to becoming a permanent resident is something called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. You might also hear it called SIJ, SIGIS, depending on who's talking about it. But basically, the short version is the child is present in the US. The child has been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both parent. The abuse could have happened in the home country. It could have happened here. That's irrelevant. The location's irrelevant, but present here, abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both parents. There's a process where the child has to go through a state court proceeding and basically be found to be under the jurisdiction of the state court and things like that. And then once there's a ruling from the state court that fits the requirements, then the child can apply for a visa petition and then eventually apply for permanent residence. Part of the downside, part of the consequence of getting residence through this is there's no way for the child to sponsor the parent, either parent. There's no grounds for that. So it's a way for children who are here. This may be a way that gives them a way to stay in the United States. As you run into children, don't assume that their family is aware of the possibilities of asylum or special immigrant juvenile status or TPS or anything else. Even if that family had contact with ICE at the border, is in active removal proceedings, they're not given, nobody's given representation in immigration court. They have a right to an attorney, but they don't have a right to have somebody pay for that attorney. So it may be that they're not aware of what's out there as a possibility for relief or a possibility for a pathway. Okay, so those are things that I always think is important to be thinking about. And remember, immigration law makes complicated families even more complicated. Well, families are complicated anyway. What I mean by that is it's very common that in a household, you might have a child who's a citizen, a child who's undocumented, a child who has SIDGE, parents who are documented or undocumented. So you may find a family that has very mixed immigration issues, all of it makes it very complicated. So this is the basics of module 1. Let's keep I'm happy to answer questions. Let's keep our questions basic, maybe, and we'll go from there.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming and agreeing to speak with us. I have a few questions, some things that I was sort of writing down as I was listening to you talk, that were, basic, that some teachers may be interested in, especially how some of these different statuses may affect their students and, their day-to-day lives. I guess to start, this is maybe very basic, but are most EL students that teachers will see, would they be classified as immigrants, non-immigrants, other, or undocumented?
So I think that's a great question. And the answer is, I think you're going to have students in all categories. So it is very common, actually, if children are raised, they may be born here, but raised in a non-English speaking household. And so it could be very possible that the student in front of you is a US citizen. Or maybe the family's been here and has residence, or they're new arrivals as permanent residents. I think realistically, I think one of the biggest challenges we're facing is really since 2014, 2015, our community, meaning Louisiana, has seen a huge increase in the number of children who are coming unaccompanied or coming at very young ages to the southern border, being admitted and in the US. And so most likely those are children who are completely undocumented. They're probably in removal proceedings, maybe. They may be under orders of supervision. They may have papers in process, they may not. And so, yeah, I think that's probably a good portion of your students, but I wouldn't assume automatically.
I guess to follow up with that, are services for EL students different based on their immigration status?
So I think when you're talking about within the school system, what they get within the school, I'm going to leave that for somebody else's presentation. That is not my area of expertise. So I get to say not my question. But where immigration status makes a huge difference is in access to what we call public benefits whether they're federal or state. And so a student who's completely undocumented, doesn't have any papers in process, probably cannot access things like Medicaid, is not going to be, the family's not going to be able to access housing support or food support or things like that. Whereas if a person is a refugee, the family has access to all of those things and a lot more. And so each different status has different eligibility for those types of benefits from the state and from the federal government. And there's a really complicated chart. So, which we can share and do another session on.
Yeah. I was gonna ask, I have a question,
Sure.
and it kind of goes in line with all of this. I have a high school student. He would love to go to college. However, he has no social security card. Therefore, he cannot get any type of federal assistance for financial aid or any. And my question was, what does he need to do to become a permanent resident? Or what does he need to do to apply? Or they deported, you know, are they going to get in more trouble? You know, and I don't want to give him the wrong information.
Yeah, so you know, first of all, we want to look at the age of your student, right? If they're under 18, there may be all sorts of things we can do, right? Like the SIDGE, they may qualify for asylum, they may qualify for that. If they're over 18, the immigration law is going to treat them like an adult. And so, you know, we look at how long have they been here? How did they get here? What are those other options that are out there? You know, is there an employer to sponsor them? Is there a family member? Things like that. And it can be really, really complicated. But oftentimes what you have is you have a student who's 18. They don't fit into any of these boxes for any relief. They've been here too long. Nobody did anything. You know, definition of a dreamer, right? And so each state has, so K-12 education is different than college education when we look at certain civil rights issues, right? And so each state has set rules about who can qualify for in-state tuition and how that connects with immigration status. Each state has set rules for who can attend based on immigration status. And so you're correct, a person who, most individuals who are not immigrants, right? So unless you're an asylee or fit into some categories, like even if I was here on a visa, I couldn't get federal financial aid. I'd have to be a permanent resident. I have to I have to meet the qualifications for financial aid. So there's rules about who can, I'm sorry, I'm kind of getting myself confused, but rules about who can get admitted, rules about who can get in-state tuition, federal rules about who can get federal aid, and then state rules about sometimes about what other aid might be available. So there are some states that will give out like state aid to individuals who have gone to high school here and things like that. It's a really, really heartbreaking situation. Those individuals can still get private scholarships, of course, things that are not based on necessarily status. And there's lots of organizations out there whose purpose is to give scholarships to dreamers. And so it's worth pursuing as well. A social security number in original intent, right, wasn't meant to be this key that unlocks all of the doors. It was meant to be your social security number, and that was it. It has become all of these other things. There are ways for the student to get what's called a tax ID number, which is just a 9-digit number. Sometimes issued by the IRS, it doesn't give permission to work, but it's a 9-digit number. Schools should all have ways for issuing 9-digit numbers that aren't socials that allow the student to sort of navigate through the school. It does lead to bigger problems, right? Like, because the student might, what's the point of going to nursing school if you can't graduate and become and actually work in your field? So, yeah, it's heartbreaking. And we need reform. Oh, wait, yeah, I didn't mean to say that.
I have a question, Kathleen. I know that most of your work and your sphere of influence is here in South Louisiana. Given those confines, can you think of any sort of one-stop organizations that someone who is new and completely lost as to how to navigate what could go to?
No.
Okay.
So, this is, this is a move that I think organizations are really trying to make. So in Louisiana, our big players, Southern Poverty Law Center, right? They keep a list of different groups that do different services. Catholic Charities likewise does a lot of different resources. They will do representation of certain individuals. They may also be able to connect with counseling. There's a great organization called ALAS, ALAS, which is for they partner with high schools about trying to sort of navigate some of these issues, but there's no great one-stop shop for any of this.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I had another question that some teachers may be wondering. I guess, what, if anything, do teachers need to know about their students' immigration status? Is this protected information, or should they just follow the lead of the students, if the students want to share something?
So I think this is a question that I think the lawyer in me, right, which is not the same as the human in me. Okay. As humans, we want to be compassionate, we want to help, we want to do all of those things. That's not necessarily where you should be. Okay. Schools, we have a long-standing case, Pyler v. Doe. Schools aren't supposed to ask about immigration status. And so as your role, where you are, you are ways in which you are acting on behalf of the school. And I think this is different for K-12 than, non-K-12 teachers. But K-12s in public schools, I think you're walking a really narrow path, right? You shouldn't be asking about those things because it's not relevant to the teaching experience. And so as a lawyer, I would say you shouldn't ask. But the truth is, for many of you, you are this kid's, this family's one person who might have the information and they're not getting it anywhere else, right? You're their person that they know. You're the person that maybe speaks their language. And so I think talking with the people around you, your colleagues, about what the policy is going to be and how are you going to deal with it? Are there pamphlets available? Are there resources available? Do you just keep a little card of website links? But I think there's, or is this something that the guidance counselor or the social worker within the school is handling? I don't think these are simple issues. And I think everybody comes to their own place, but don't be surprised if your institution doesn't have your back, right? If you're acting outside the scope of your office. I thought of another great resource, which is called Appleseed, has a really great book meant for basically neighbors and helpers that talks about what to do when somebody's in removal proceedings, or what to do when there's a child with a family where the parent might get deported. I'll send you guys the link for it, and you can put it in the comments.
Great.
Yeah, I've got it sitting on my shelf, and so it's great. It's a great resource. Yeah, I think these questions aren't always easily answered.
Diane or Carolyn, did y'all have any more questions?
I don't have any more questions, but if you're ready, I'll talk a little bit about this program and what we're trying to do at LaTESOL. Yes, and,
Great
you know,
idea.
Kathleen has given us a wonderful segue. What we're trying to do at LaTESOL is creating a series of presentations called Navigating Immigration Issues for Louisiana Educators. And our intention is not to create net new material, but to gather some of the material that we have found as Louisiana TESOL is already out there, but it's in different places. Sometimes it's recorded, sometimes it's not. And we want to bring that together and make it available to Louisiana educators in our website by going through our website. So they have one place they can go at least and find out what we know is going on out there. Some of the topics that we attend to address are, and the very next one will be, legal obligations of schools. And the Southern Poverty Law Center, with their subsidiary Learning for Justice, has put together some great resources on legal obligations for schools, and that's very much on our teachers' minds. So expect to see that one soon. Also, we're very interested in the subject of legal access, not just Title VI and legal access in schools, but no one exists in a vacuum, right? None of the students do, but what is the legal access in healthcare and in the justice system? And there is an organization called the Louisiana Language Access Coalition, and we hope to bring them forward in a presentation to our Louisiana educators. We want to talk about language access and ICE, which is a very specific subject of language access, but one, again, of particular interest, not far from home for Louisiana educators. There are times when our teachers need to be involved in non-immigration legal aspects of their students' lives. And Kathleen mentioned the organization, and we're going to try to get someone in here who can talk to us about how to write mitigation letters on behalf of students, should the teacher so choose to do that. Then there are special situations related to domestic violence and child abuse. Where does a teacher go if she's seen that or he's seen that? We want to do a little module on that very big subject.
I was sorry to interrupt, but I was speaking with Kathleen prior to the webinar, and she suggested including a module, or perhaps in this module, talking about deportation proceedings and how teachers can help if or get involved if a student is actively involved in deportation proceedings.
Yes, and one of those actions is the mitigation letter. So yes, that's very much a subject that we want to bring into this format. Unfortunately, a newly emerging topic, or maybe not newly emerging, but very much discussed topic now, is labor trafficking. And how does a teacher identify it and respond to it if they believe it's going on? There are many resources out there, and we are, again, not trying to reinvent any wheels, but bring resources together. There is one part of this project that we're going to ask all of our Louisiana educators to participate in, and that is, we need to collect a statewide list of what resources are available in our state. We tend to know a little bit more about what's going on in South Louisiana, maybe because there's a lot more going on in South Louisiana, but we really need to know and compile information that's relevant throughout the states. And we might be calling on teachers this summer to see if they can help us out with that. So those are the current plans for these modules, John. This is a very new project, and so if anyone has any ideas, they should contact cjones40@tulane.edu and let me know what their ideas are. So that's all I have to say. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Diane. And thank you, John, for moderating.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope we have poured a solid foundation.
Yes, I think we have. John, any comments?
I'd like to thank you, Kathleen, for coming and giving our inaugural talk of this module series. I was just collecting some links to put into the chat, so if anyone's curious, they can access them. So I put a link to your law firm there, and I also would like to put a link to the LaTESOL, Louisiana TESOL website, which I'm doing right now. So people can know where to find the recording and the slides for this talk in the future. I'd also like to thank Carolyn Jones here for putting together this module series and really being the sort of motivating force behind it. So thank you so much for all your work on this, Carolyn and Kathleen, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. Please keep in touch if you have questions or interested in future modules or in our conference later on this year.
Thank you so much.
And we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.